Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland today rolling out her latest pre-budget announcement, this one for first-time home buyers. If the budget passes, starting on August 1st, a first-time home buyer could get a 30-year mortgage amortization if they're buying a new build home, and they'd be able to draw $60,000 from their RRSP to help make their down payment, up from the current $35,000. We're now just over 2 weeks into federal budget announcements that have topped $18 billion in new spending promises. Is the rollout strategy moving the needle? Well, Abacus data is reporting its biggest lead yet for the Conservatives, with their vote tracking showing that if an election were held today, 44% of committed voters would go Conservative, 24% to the Liberals, and 17% to the NDP. And looking ahead to next week's federal budget, the latest numbers from the Angus Reid Institute show the majority of Canadians are concerned or very concerned with the size of the government's deficit. For more on all of that, let's bring in two of this country's top pollsters. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute, and David Colleto is the founder, chair, and CEO of Abacus Data. Hi, Shachi. Hi, David. Good to see you both.
Good to see you, Vashi.
Hey, Vashi.
David, I'll start with you. Just with those top-line numbers, we were all kind of sitting alongside pollsters over the past few weeks wondering if and when there would be any movement, considering the Liberals are employing this very different strategy in the lead up to the budget. I know it's early, but you polled from the 3rd to the 9th, is that right? And you found the Conservatives are still wide ahead.
Yeah, we found them 20 points ahead. The Liberals are up 1 point, and that's within the margin of error. So a slight increase for the Conservatives. Remember, it also comes on the heels of the carbon levy price tax increase on April 1st. So it's hard to distinguish, like, what's causing what. But if we're trying to measure the effect of all of these budget announcements, there doesn't appear to be any favorable movement for the Liberals. Everything we track, from the Prime Minister's approval rating to the direction of the country, are all either the same as they were weeks ago, or in some cases a little bit worse off.
And what's your instinct about whether or not that is? I know you're saying with the carbon tax it's hard to delineate, but you know, it's been about a week and a half at this point, 2 weeks, that we've had those announcements. Is it too soon to be able to tell if they're having at least starting to have an impact, or is it enough time to be able to discern that?
I think we could start to assess whether it's having an impact, but I think one of the things we learned in our survey, we asked respondents whether they were even aware that the Prime Minister and other ministers announced the National School Food Program on April 1st. And again, this is over a week after. Less than half of Canadians even knew that program was announced. And so I think the big question is, one, can the government communicate to Canadians anymore if it's not using direct to kind of voter or Canadian type of methods like advertising? And two, even if they can get that information to people, is it going to matter? We one really interesting stat from that study found that among those who really don't like Justin Trudeau, 66% thought that national school food program was a good idea. Now, what does that tell me? It doesn't mean that these are people who are going to automatically switch and say, okay, all of a sudden I like them. But it does say that you can have a good idea, you could put it out in the public domain, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is people want a change in government or they don't like the Prime Minister.
Shachi, I wanted to get you to weigh in on that before I ask you about your poll today, which is focused on how Canadians feel about the size of the deficit, and just your sense of how soon we might be able to figure out whether or not this strategy from the Liberals is able to allow them to make a dent in any of the support for the Conservatives.
It's challenging because there is, as David's pointed out, this almost the cross your arm factor or the cover your ears factor. Canadians are tuned out. This is a government that's been saying a lot of the same things in different ways for the better part of 8 years. And I mean, hey, at least they're consistent. But at the same time, it at some point is going to start to just sound like blah, blah, blah. And so we've seen that. We see the way, more than 6 months of announcements around housing, around affordability, around the school food program, even around defense spending, the health accord, all of it does not seem to be moving the needle at all. And in fairness, it's going to be a long time before a lot of these programs actually start to trickle down to Canadians at the household level, where they can connect the dots between that announcement and this thing making my life easier. So there is that, but of course you can never rule out the fact that campaigns matter. And while it feels like this is very campaigny at the moment. Canadians know there's very little likelihood of going to the polls in a federal election anytime soon. And as a result, I think there's just a sense of that tune out. The tune back in happens during a campaign period.
So they might tune into the budget. However, usually every year there is some, media around that. We were just collectively speaking about the strategy is different this time, but we won't, I don't think, find out what the deficit is until the budget is actually tabled on Tuesday. You've done some work in the field to find out if Canadians feel one way or the other, basically, about the size of it. What did you find?
Well, the really interesting thing is that even before that start of April flurry of $18 billion worth of announcements came out, 60% of Canadians already thought that government was spending too much. And that includes, by the way, 1 in 3 current Liberal voters, to say nothing of the nearly 90% of Conservative voters, the 76% of Bloc voters, and the nearly 40% of NDP voters. So again, this is something that is really across the political spectrum. And one thing that really stands out is when you look at people who voted Liberal in 2021 but are drifting away to other parties, nearly 50% of that group says, you know what, the spending, it's too much now. Relative to that 30% of current Liberal voters. So you even there see the divide and the delineation about how Canadians who voted Liberal in the past are really starting to drift away from the party on things like spending, on things like affordability. There's also, as always, some contradictory stuff that comes out of these data, because on one hand, you do have that strong majority who say, well, we're worried that there's too much spending happening, but at the same time, when it comes to health care, when it comes to defense spending, so that is maybe a bit of a proof point for the government in the same way that school food program is, Canadians want more spending. Well, so which is it? Is it too much spending or is it more spending? But it's more spending on really targeted things like health care.
I just have about a minute left, and that spending that is happening, David, is pretty targeted to address issues in the government's view that are particularly being felt by younger Canadians. What are your numbers in those demographics showing you?
Well, I think the biggest story in Canadian politics over the last year has actually been the switch of those younger voters from being the lifesavers for the Liberals in the last 2 federal elections to being the cohort that's sinking them right now. And I think the gap has grown to 20 points nationally because the Conservatives now lead by almost 20 points among those under 30. In our most recent poll, they lead by the same margin among millennials as well. And so, Vashi, again, if you had said to me 2 years ago that the Liberals would be more popular among older Canadians than they are among younger ones, I would say that's crazy. Go back, that poll's no good. But that's where we are today. And so this budget and all the work that they've done over the last 10 days to roll out these measures, as they've admitted, is targeted at younger Canadians. And they cannot win the next election if the Conservatives win that cohort. There's no way that it happens. And so this will be a real test to see whether they can convince these young Canadians to come back and embrace the Liberals like they have basically for the last 8 years of this government.
Last word to you on that, Shachi.
Yeah, this is all, I would largely agree. We're seeing the same thing that David is seeing, and it's little wonder that older Canadians are sticking with the Liberals to the extent that they are, again, because older Canadians are the ones dealing least with housing and affordability issues. But again, I wonder if there is enough time to actually turn that around in terms of practical help to those younger families, those younger Canadians who are fleeing the Liberal ship.
Yeah, such a good point. The stuff they're announcing, if it helps, will take a while to do so. I'm going to leave it on that note. Shachi, Kurl, and David Colleto, thank you both so much for your insights this evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vashi.